The day started like any other at the bustling international airport. Travelers from all walks of life hurried through the terminals, dragging suitcases behind them or clutching boarding passes tightly as they navigated the crowded hallways. The hum of conversations mixed with announcements over the intercom created a symphony of organized chaos. Among the sea of faces was Dr. Maya Thompson, a woman whose presence commanded respect, even in the most chaotic environments. Maya wasn't just another traveler. She was a highly accomplished neurosurgeon returning home after delivering a keynote speech at a prestigious medical conference abroad. Her schedule had been packed with meetings, presentations, and networking events, leaving her exhausted but fulfilled. Now, as she made her way toward her gate, she felt a sense of relief knowing that soon she'd be relaxing in the comfort of first class for the long journey ahead. Dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer paired with sleek black trousers, Maya exuded professionalism. Her posture was upright, her steps confident, and her demeanor calm despite the whirlwind around her. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, something that came naturally to someone who spent years saving lives in operating rooms. Yet beneath her composed exterior, Maya couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement about finally sitting back and enjoying some well-deserved rest. As she approached the gate, the airline staff greeted her warmly, recognizing her status as a frequent flyer and a valued customer. "Welcome back, Dr. Thompson," one of the attendants said with a polite smile, before handing her a menu card showcasing the gourmet meals available on board. Maya nodded appreciatively, thanking the attendant before proceeding down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin gleamed with luxury. Plush leather seats lined both sides of the aisle, each equipped with personal entertainment screens, adjustable lighting, and ample legroom. Soft ambient music played in the background, creating an atmosphere of tranquility. Attendants moved gracefully between rows, assisting passengers with their belongings and offering refreshments before takeoff. It was clear that this section catered to those accustomed to finer things in life. Maya found her assigned seat near the front of the cabin, a prime spot offering extra privacy and quick access during emergencies. She settled into the chair, relishing the plush cushioning and spacious design. As she adjusted her seatbelt and arranged her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, she couldn't help but admire the attention to detail that went into making this experience exceptional. A glass of sparkling water arrived moments later, courtesy of a cheerful flight attendant who introduced herself as Sarah. "If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask," Sarah said warmly before moving on to assist other passengers. Everything seemed perfect so far, until Captain Richard Hayes entered the scene. Known among his peers for his arrogance and inflated ego, Hayes prided himself on being one of the best pilots in the industry. With decades of experience under his belt and countless hours logged in the cockpit, he believed he deserved every ounce of admiration he received. But what many didn't realize was that Hayes's confidence often crossed the line into arrogance, especially when it came to interacting with others. Hayes stepped into the first-class cabin midway through boarding, wearing his crisp uniform adorned with shiny badges and stripes symbolizing his rank. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he strode down the aisle, pausing briefly to exchange pleasantries with select passengers. To those unfamiliar with his personality, Hayes appeared charming and professional, an image he carefully cultivated to maintain his reputation. However, anyone who knew him well understood that beneath the surface lay a man deeply rooted in prejudice and entitlement. When Hayes reached Maya's row, he stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in her appearance. He scanned her outfit, noting its elegance, yet something about her presence unsettled him. Perhaps it was her poise, or maybe it was the fact that she occupied a seat he subconsciously associated with privilege and power. Whatever the reason, Hayes's mind immediately jumped to conclusions based on stereotypes rather than facts. "Excuse me, miss," he began, his voice laced with condescension. "This area is reserved for first-class passengers only. You might want to double-check your ticket." His tone dripped with insincerity, as though he already assumed she didn't belong here. Several nearby passengers glanced up from their books or phones, curious about the exchange unfolding before them. For a moment, Maya simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without missing a beat, she replied calmly, I assure you I'm in the correct seat. Reaching into her blazer pocket, she retrieved her boarding pass and held it out for him to see. The document clearly displayed her name, seat number, and class confirmation. There was no denying it, she belonged exactly where she was, but instead of apologizing or moving on, Hayes lingered, his smirk growing wider. "Oh, really?" he said mockingly, leaning closer as if trying to intimidate her. "Well, aren't you full of surprises? Must have pulled some strings to get here, huh?" His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, casting a shadow over the otherwise pleasant ambiance of the cabin. Passengers within earshot shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Some exchanged glances, silently communicating their disapproval of Hayes's behavior. Others buried their faces in magazines or pretended to focus on their screens, hoping to avoid becoming collateral damage in whatever conflict was brewing. Despite the growing tension, Maya remained unfazed. Years of facing challenges in male-dominated spaces had taught her how to handle situations like this with grace and composure. She straightened her posture slightly, meeting Hayes's gaze head-on. "Actually," she said evenly, "I earned my place here through hard work and dedication, not connections. If you're curious, I'm a neurosurgeon, and I've spent the past week speaking at a medical conference overseas." Her response caught Hayes off guard, though he quickly masked his surprise with a dismissive chuckle. "Sure thing, sweetheart," he replied, waving a hand as though brushing aside her explanation. "Whatever helps you sleep at night." With that, he turned on his heel and continued down the aisle, leaving Maya seated in silence. Though outwardly composed, she couldn't ignore the sting of his words or the underlying message they conveyed. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered such treatment, nor would it likely be the last. But something about this particular encounter felt different, as if fate had placed her in this situation for a reason. Little did she know, the real drama was just beginning. And by the end of the flight, nothing would ever be the same again. For her, for Hayes, or for anyone else involved. The tension in the first-class cabin lingered like an unwelcome guest after Captain Hayes's dismissive remark. Maya sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, but her mind was far from calm. She replayed his words in her head, condescending, dismissive, and laced with thinly veiled prejudice. Though she had faced similar situations before, this time felt different. Maybe it was the public setting, or perhaps it was the sheer audacity of a man in such a position of authority making assumptions about her based solely on appearances. Whatever it was, Maya couldn't shake off the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. Across the aisle, a young man named Alex Carter leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued by the exchange he had just witnessed. Alex was no ordinary traveler. He was a journalist known for uncovering stories that exposed hypocrisy and injustice. He had been sent to cover a high-profile aviation summit. But now, as he watched the scene unfold, he realized he might have stumbled upon a story far more compelling than anything on his agenda. With a quick glance around to ensure no one was paying attention, Alex discreetly pulled out his phone and began recording. Hayes, still strolling down the aisle, seemed oblivious to the fact that he was being documented. His arrogance blinded him to the reactions of those around him. Some passengers exchanged uneasy glances, while others shook their heads in disapproval. A middle-aged woman seated near Maya muttered under her breath, "What a disgrace," loud. Enough for her neighbor to hear. But Hayes pressed on, seemingly convinced that his behavior was acceptable, even justified. When he reached the rear of the first-class section, Hayes paused momentarily, turning back toward Maya's seat. Perhaps it was the weight of the stairs boring into him, or maybe it was the gnawing sense that he hadn't quite made his point clear enough. Whatever the reason, he decided to double down. Striding back to Maya's row, he planted himself firmly in the aisle, arms crossed over his chest, and addressed her once again. "So, Doc," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "you're telling me you got where you are all on your own? No help from anyone?" The question hung in the air, heavy with insinuation. It wasn't really a question at all. It was a challenge. A way for Hayes to assert dominance and remind everyone within earshot of his supposed superiority. Maya looked up at him, her expression calm but firm. She didn't need to raise her voice to command respect. Her presence alone spoke volumes. "I worked hard for everything I've achieved," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And if you're implying otherwise, then I suggest you reconsider your assumptions." Her response drew murmurs of approval from nearby passengers. One elderly gentleman sitting 2 rows ahead nodded approvingly, muttering, "Good for her." Even Sarah, the flight attendant who had greeted Maya earlier, shot Hayes a disapproving look as she passed by with a tray of beverages. But Hayes wasn't deterred. If anything, the growing disapproval only fueled his defiance. "Well, aren't we full of ourselves?" Hayes sneered, leaning closer to Maya's seat. "You know, not everyone gets to fly first class. Most people have to earn it, not just show up and expect special treatment." The comment struck a nerve, not just with Maya, but with several other passengers as well. A man seated directly across from her, dressed in a sharp suit and tie, cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me, Captain," he interjected, his voice carrying a note of authority. "I couldn't help but overhear your remarks. As someone who has flown this route many times, I can assure you that Dr. Thompson belongs here as much as anyone else. In fact, she probably deserves it more than most." The man introduced himself as Mr. Langley, a retired airline executive, who had spent decades overseeing operations for major carriers. His words carried weight, and Hayes visibly stiffened upon hearing them. But instead of backing down, Hayes attempted to deflect. "Oh, come on," he said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You're not seriously taking her side, are you?" "I'm not taking sides," Langley replied coolly. "I'm simply pointing out that your behavior is unprofessional and unacceptable. And let me tell you something. I've heard rumors about pilots like you. Pilots who think they're above reproach because of their rank. Let's just say your reputation precedes you." The comment hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. His face reddened, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he appeared rattled. Passengers who had been silently observing the exchange started chiming in, voicing their support for Maya and criticizing Hayes' conduct. A young mother traveling with her toddler leaned over and whispered to her husband, "Can you believe this guy? Who does he think he is?" Even Alex, still recording from across the aisle, couldn't resist adding his 2 cents. "For what?" "It's worth, Captain," he said, raising his voice just enough to be heard. "This entire conversation is being recorded, just so you know." Hayes froze, his eyes darting toward Alex and then to the phone in his hand. For a moment, panic flickered across his face, but he quickly masked it with a forced grin. "Oh, is that right?" he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Well, go ahead and record away. Freedom of speech, isn't that what they call it?" But his bravado rang hollow. The damage was done. Passengers continued to voice their disapproval, some louder than others. A businessman in the row behind Maya stood up briefly, holding his boarding pass aloft. "We paid good money to sit here, same as her," he declared. "If anyone doesn't belong, it's you." By now, the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What had started as a quiet confrontation between 2 individuals had escalated into a collective outcry against Hayes' behavior. Flight attendants hovered nervously nearby, unsure how to de-escalate the situation without drawing further attention to it. Even the co-pilot, who had entered the cabin moments earlier to assist with pre-flight checks, hesitated in the doorway, clearly sensing that something was amiss. Through it all, Maya remained composed. She didn't engage in the escalating drama, beyond responding to Hayes' initial comments. Instead, she focused on maintaining her dignity, knowing that reacting emotionally would only give him more ammunition. Still, she couldn't ignore the wave of solidarity washing over her from fellow passengers. Their support buoyed her spirits and reminded her that she wasn't alone in standing up to injustice. As the minutes ticked by, Hayes grew increasingly agitated. Realizing he was losing control of the narrative, he muttered something about needing to prepare for takeoff and retreated toward the cockpit. But the tension he left behind was palpable. Passengers resumed their conversations, though the topic had shifted entirely to the incident that had just unfolded. Some expressed outrage while others marveled at Maya's poise under pressure. Everyone agreed on one thing: Hayes's actions were indefensible. Seated in her plush leather chair, Maya took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to process everything that had happened. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly or treated as less than they were. And while she couldn't predict what would happen next, one thing was certain: this encounter was far from over. As the plane taxied down the runway, the hum of engines filled the cabin, momentarily drowning out the tension that still lingered in the air. Passengers busied themselves with adjusting their seats, stowing away personal items, or scrolling through their phones to distract from the awkward energy left behind by Captain Hayes's behavior. But for Maya, the confrontation was far from forgotten. She sat quietly, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her boarding pass as she reflected on what had just transpired. Across the aisle, Alex Carter leaned back in his seat, his phone still discreetly recording. He wasn't sure how much footage he'd captured, enough to document the incident clearly, but not so much that it would raise suspicion if anyone noticed. His mind raced with possibilities. This wasn't just a story. It was a moment that could spark real change. As a journalist, Alex knew the power of storytelling, and this one felt different. It wasn't about sensationalism or clicks. It was about exposing the truth and holding someone accountable for their actions. But Alex wasn't the only person processing what had happened. Nearby passengers continued to whisper among themselves, their voices low but charged with emotion. Some expressed admiration for Maya's composure, while others vented their frustration over Hayes's arrogance. One elderly woman seated near the window turned to her companion and said, "I've been flying for decades and I've never seen anything like this. That man should be ashamed of himself." The sentiment rippled through the cabin, creating an unspoken bond among those who had witnessed the confrontation. Even Mr. Langley, the retired airline executive, remained visibly unsettled. Leaning forward slightly, he caught Maya's eye and gave her a reassuring nod. "You handled that beautifully," he said softly. "Don't let him get to you." Maya offered a small smile in return, appreciating the gesture. Still, she couldn't shake the weight of the situation. While she was grateful for the support of her fellow passengers, part of her wondered if anything would come of it. Would Hayes face consequences for his actions, or would this simply fade into the background? Another example of unchecked privilege. Meanwhile, Hayes himself was seething inside the cockpit. Sitting in the captain's chair, he gripped the controls tighter than necessary, his knuckles white against the polished metal. He replayed the confrontation in his mind, each memory twisting further into self-justification. She started it, he thought bitterly. If she hadn't looked so out of place, none of this would have happened. To him, the fault lay entirely with Maya, and with the passengers who dared to side with her. But reality refused to align with his distorted perspective. When the co-pilot, a younger man named Eric, glanced at him quizzically, Hayes snapped, "What are you looking at?" The sharpness of his tone startled Eric, who quickly averted his gaze and focused on his instruments. Though Eric didn't say anything, he couldn't help but notice how agitated Hayes seemed. Something was clearly wrong, but Eric decided it. Wasn't his place to ask, at least not yet. Back in the cabin, the mood shifted subtly as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Attendants moved efficiently between rows, offering drinks and snacks to passengers eager to settle into the flight. Sarah, the cheerful flight attendant who had greeted Maya earlier, approached her seat once again. This time, however, her demeanor was more subdued. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" she asked gently, her eyes conveying silent empathy. Maya shook her head, thanking her politely. "I'm fine, really," she replied, though her tone hinted at the emotional toll the encounter had taken. Sensing Maya's need for space, Sarah nodded and moved on, leaving her to her thoughts. It wasn't until the plane reached cruising altitude that Alex finally made his move. Gathering his courage, he stood up and walked over to Maya's seat, introducing himself properly. "Hi, I'm Alex," he said, extending a hand. "I don't want to intrude, but I wanted to let you know that I recorded what happened earlier." If you're okay with it, I'd like to share it. With your permission, of course. Maya raised an eyebrow, surprised but not entirely shocked. You recorded it? She asked cautiously. Alex nodded, pulling out his phone to show her the footage. I'm a journalist, he explained, and I think this is important. People need to see this, not just to call out bad behavior, but to highlight the strength and grace you showed in handling it. For a moment, Maya hesitated. Sharing such a personal moment with the world carried risks, and she knew all too well how stories like hers could be twisted or misinterpreted online. But then she thought about the bigger picture, the countless others who might find courage in her experience or the potential for accountability where none existed before. After a long pause, she nodded. Okay, she said firmly. But only if we do it right. No clickbait headlines, no sensationalizing, just the truth. Relieved and grateful, Alex agreed immediately. Absolutely, he said earnestly. I promise. I'll handle this with care. With Maya's blessing, he began drafting a plan in his head, already envisioning the impact the video could have. Unbeknownst to either of them, Mr. Langley had been listening intently to their conversation. Once Alex returned to his seat, Langley leaned over and whispered to Maya, "That young man is onto something. You realize this isn't just about you, don't you? This is about sending a message. To him, to the airline, and to everyone else who thinks they can treat people this way without consequence." Maya nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She understood the stakes, even if she hadn't fully processed them yet. This wasn't just a single incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one that demanded attention and action. As the hours passed, the initial shock of the confrontation began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of anticipation. Passengers continued to discuss the incident in hushed tones, speculating about what might happen next. Some wondered whether Hayes would apologize upon landing. Others doubted he'd show any remorse at all. Meanwhile, Alex worked quietly on his laptop, editing the footage and crafting a narrative that balanced outrage with hope. By the time the plane began its descent, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed once again. What had started as a tense standoff had evolved into a shared mission, a collective determination to ensure that justice was served. For Maya, the journey had become more than just a flight home. It was a catalyst for change, a reminder that standing up for oneself could inspire others to do the same. And as the wheels touched down on the tarmac, no one aboard realized just how far-reaching the repercussions of that day would be. The moment the plane's wheels kissed the tarmac, signaling the end of the flight, a palpable shift rippled through the cabin. Passengers began gathering their belongings, zipping up bags, and stretching after hours of sitting still. But unlike most flights where disembarking was a routine affair, this time there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a shared understanding that something significant had occurred and its aftermath was about to unfold. As soon as the seatbelt sign switched off, Alex wasted no time. He quickly uploaded the edited video to his social media platforms, titling it, "Pilot's Disrespectful Behavior Toward First-Class Passenger Goes Viral." Within minutes, the clip began spreading like wildfire. The internet, always hungry for content that exposed hypocrisy and injustice, latched onto the story with fervor. Comments poured in by the thousands, each one amplifying the outrage felt by those who watched the exchange unfold. Some viewers praised Maya for her poise and professionalism, marveling at how she maintained her composure despite being subjected to blatant disrespect. Others directed their anger toward Captain Hayes, calling him out for his arrogance and prejudice. One commenter wrote, "This is why we need more accountability in positions of power. How dare he treat someone like this?" Another added, "Maya handled it perfectly. No yelling, no drama, just pure class." But the reaction wasn't limited to individual comments. News outlets picked up on the story almost instantly, recognizing its potential to spark a larger conversation about discrimination and privilege. Within hours, hashtags like #Justice for Maya and "Accountability in Aviation" began trending globally. Talk shows, morning news programs, and podcasts featured segments discussing the incident, dissecting every detail while inviting experts to weigh in on workplace bias and systemic racism. Back at the airport, passengers disembarked slowly, many pausing to offer Maya words of encouragement before heading toward baggage claim or customs. A young woman stopped briefly to thank her, saying, "You inspired me today, I hope you know that." An older man simply shook her hand and said, "Well done." Even strangers who hadn't witnessed the confrontation firsthand approached her after hearing whispers of what had happened on board. It was clear that Maya's quiet strength had resonated deeply with those around her. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes exited the aircraft through a separate door reserved for crew members, avoiding eye contact with anyone along the way. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tightly as if bracing himself for what lay ahead. He knew the situation could spiral out of control. He'd seen similar incidents ruin careers, but he refused to acknowledge his role in creating the mess. Instead, he convinced himself that he was the victim, unfairly targeted because of political correctness run amok. Hayes's attempts to deflect responsibility were short-lived, however. As soon as he entered the terminal, he was met by two airline representatives waiting anxiously near the gate. Their expressions were grim, betraying the seriousness of the situation. "Captain Hayes," one of them said tersely, "we need to speak with you immediately." Without waiting for a response, they escorted him to a private conference room tucked away from prying eyes. Inside, the walls were lined with framed awards and certificates celebrating the airline's achievements. A stark contrast to the tension filling the space. Sitting across from Hayes were senior executives, including the head of public relations, whose phone buzzed incessantly with updates from social media and press inquiries. "We've got a problem," the PR executive stated bluntly, sliding a tablet across the table toward Hayes. On the screen was Alex's viral video, paused at a particularly damning moment when Hayes sneered, "Sure thing, sweetheart." Below the video, angry captions and comments scrolled endlessly, painting a picture of widespread disapproval. Hayes leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "It's not my fault people are overreacting," he muttered, his tone defiant. "She started it." The executives exchanged incredulous looks. One of them, a stern woman named Ms. Patel, leaned forward and fixed him with a steely gaze. "Let's be clear, Richard," she said sharply. "This isn't about overreacting, this is about your behavior. Behavior that violates our company's code of conduct and tarnishes our reputation. Do you have any idea how much damage this has caused?" Hayes opened his mouth to argue, but thought better of it. For the first time in years, he found himself unable to justify his actions. The weight of the accusations pressed down on him, leaving him momentarily speechless. While the executives deliberated behind closed doors, the airline's customer service team scrambled to respond to the flood of complaints pouring in. Emails, phone calls, and social media messages demanded accountability, with many threatening to boycott the airline unless swift action was taken. Some passengers even canceled upcoming flights, citing the incident as evidence of a toxic corporate culture. To make matters worse, internal documents leaked to Alex revealed troubling information about Hayes's history within the company. It turned out that this wasn't the first time he had been accused of discriminatory behavior. Years earlier, a junior flight attendant had filed a formal complaint alleging verbal abuse and harassment. At the time, the airline had chosen to sweep the matter under the rug, fearing the negative publicity that might arise from disciplining a high-profile pilot. Other incidents followed, but none resulted in meaningful consequences for Hayes. When Alex published these revelations alongside the original video, the backlash intensified. Critics accused the airline of enabling bad behavior by prioritizing profit over ethics. Protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters holding signs that read, "No more excuses and fire him now." Employees spoke out anonymously, sharing stories of similar experiences with management turning a blind eye to misconduct. Faced with mounting pressure, the airline issued a public apology, acknowledging the harm caused by Hayes's actions and promising to take corrective measures. However, many viewed the statement as insincere, pointing out that the company had failed to act until forced into the spotlight. Calls for systemic reform grew louder, with advocacy groups urging the airline to implement stricter policies and hold offenders accountable regardless of rank or tenure. Amid the chaos, Maya remained grounded. Though she appreciated the support pouring in from strangers around the world, she didn't revel in Hayes's downfall. Instead, she used the platform thrust upon her to advocate for change. In interviews with major news outlets, she emphasized the importance of addressing systemic issues rather than focusing solely on individual cases. "What happened to me is not unique," she said during one appearance. "It happens every day to countless others who don't have the same opportunities to speak up. We need to create environments where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." Her words struck a chord, inspiring organizations across industries to reevaluate their own practices. Companies began hosting workshops on unconscious bias and implementing zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory behavior. Social media campaigns encouraged employees to share their stories, fostering a sense of solidarity among those who had long suffered in silence. Though the road to lasting change would be long and challenging, Maya's courage sparked a movement. One that showed no signs of slowing down. And as the dust settled, it became clear that the ripple effects of that single flight would continue to shape conversations about equality and justice for years to come. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the fallout from Captain Hayes's actions had reached a fever pitch. News outlets were ablaze with coverage of the incident, and hashtags like Justice for Maya dominated social media platforms worldwide. The sheer volume of outrage left the airline scrambling to regain control of its narrative, but every attempt at damage control seemed to backfire. Passengers continued to boycott flights, employees demanded internal investigations, and advocacy groups called for sweeping reforms within the aviation industry. Inside the airline's corporate headquarters, executives convened an emergency meeting to address the crisis. The boardroom was tense, with faces etched in frustration and fear. Ms. Patel, the head of public relations, stood at the front of the room, her laptop displaying real-time updates of the growing backlash. "We're hemorrhaging goodwill," she said bluntly. "If we don't act decisively and quickly, this could destroy us." The CEO, a man named Gregory Langston, leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. "What are our options?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Ms. Patel hesitated before replying. "There's only one viable option: terminate Captain Hayes immediately. Anything less will look like we're protecting him, and that's the last thing we need right now." A murmur rippled through the room as other executives exchanged uneasy glances. Some argued that firing Hayes would set a dangerous precedent, while others insisted it was the only way to salvage the company's reputation. Ultimately, the decision came down to cold, hard pragmatism. The cost of keeping Hayes on staff far outweighed any loyalty they might feel toward him. Reluctantly, they agreed to let him go. Within hours, a terse press release was issued announcing Hayes's termination. In light of recent events, the statement read, "We have determined that Captain Richard Hayes is no longer fit to represent our airline. His behavior was unacceptable and does not align with our values of respect, inclusivity, and professionalism." The announcement was accompanied by promises of mandatory sensitivity training for all employees and the establishment of a task force dedicated to addressing systemic issues within the organization. While many applauded the airline's decision, others remained skeptical. Critics pointed out that the move felt reactive rather than proactive, questioning whether the company truly intended to implement meaningful change or simply wanted to appease the public. Protesters outside the headquarters held up signs reading, "Actions speak louder than words," demanding tangible proof of reform. Meanwhile, Hayes himself retreated into isolation. Stripped of his uniform and his livelihood, he struggled to comprehend how quickly his world had unraveled. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone whose name had become synonymous with arrogance and prejudice. Even his family grew weary of his excuses, urging him to take responsibility for his actions instead of blaming everyone else. Desperate for income, Hayes eventually found work as a flight instructor at a small regional school, a far cry from the glamorous life he once led. The job paid little, and the students were often inexperienced beginners who required immense patience. For someone like Hayes, accustomed to commanding authority and deference, the role was humbling in the truest sense of the word. At first, Hayes approached the position with thinly veiled resentment. He snapped at students for minor mistakes, dismissed their questions with condescending remarks, and generally made himself unpopular among both trainees and co-workers. But over time, something began to shift. Whether it was the steady stream of feedback from his supervisors or the candid conversations he had with younger pilots eager to learn, Hayes slowly started to see himself through their eyes. One particularly pivotal moment occurred during a routine training session. A young woman named Clara, fresh out of aviation school, struggled to master a tricky maneuver during a simulated flight exercise. Frustrated with her repeated attempts, Hayes barked, "You'll never make it if you can't get this right." Clara froze, visibly shaken by his words. After a long pause, she replied softly, "I'm trying my best, sir, but maybe I'd do better if you explained things differently instead of just criticizing me." Her response caught Hayes off guard. For the first time, he saw the impact of his words, not just on Clara, but on countless others he had dismissed or belittled throughout his career. That night, unable to sleep, he replayed the conversation in his mind, reflecting on how often he had assumed superiority without earning it. It was a sobering realization, one that forced him to confront the person he had become. On Maya's side, life began returning to some semblance of normalcy, or at least as close to normal as possible given the circumstances. Her newfound fame brought opportunities she hadn't anticipated, including invitations to speak at conferences, write opinion pieces, and collaborate with organizations focused on diversity and inclusion. Yet despite the accolades, Maya remained grounded, refusing to let the spotlight overshadow her core mission, advocating for systemic change. During an interview with Alex Carter, who had become a trusted ally, Maya reflected on the incident and its aftermath. "This wasn't about revenge or punishment," she said firmly. "It was about accountability. When people in positions of power abuse that privilege, it sends a message that certain behaviors are acceptable. And that's what we need to challenge, not just in aviation but everywhere." Alex nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think the airline's response was enough, or is there more they should be doing?" Maya sighed, choosing her words carefully. "They've taken steps in the right direction, but actions speak louder than promises. Real change requires commitment, long-term investment in education, policy reform, and creating spaces where marginalized voices are heard and valued. Until we see that happening consistently, we can't say the job is done." Her comments resonated deeply with audiences, sparking renewed calls for transparency and accountability across industries. Inspired by her example, individuals began sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination, adding momentum to the movement she had inadvertently ignited. Schools, hospitals, corporations, and government agencies launched initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity, recognizing that the ripple effects of Maya's courage extended far beyond the confines of a single airplane cabin. As weeks turned into months, the story of the arrogant pilot and the resilient neurosurgeon became a symbol of hope for many. It served as a reminder that even in moments of injustice, grace and integrity could lead to meaningful change. Though the journey was far from over, Maya's unwavering determination inspired countless others to stand up, speak out, and demand a better future for themselves and for generations to come. Months had passed since the fateful flight that changed everything, but its echoes lingered in ways no one could have predicted. The story of Captain Hayes' fall from grace and Dr. Maya Thompson's quiet triumph continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. For Maya, life had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by purpose and reflection. She carried herself with the same poise she always had, yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet confidence born from knowing she had made a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the city skyline, Maya sat down for an interview with Alex Carter. They had grown close over the months, their initial encounter blossoming into a friendship rooted in mutual respect and shared values. Sitting across from each other in a cozy cafe, They revisited the events that had brought them together. "I've thought a lot about what happened," Maya began, her voice steady but thoughtful. "At first I felt angry, not just at him but at the system that allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. But then I realized anger isn't productive unless it fuels action." Alex nodded, leaning forward slightly. "You channeled that energy into something meaningful. You didn't let bitterness consume you." Maya smiled faintly. "It wasn't easy. There were moments when I questioned whether speaking out was worth it. But seeing how many people resonated with my experience reminded me why it mattered. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong." Their conversation turned to the broader impact of the incident. Thanks to Maya's advocacy, the airline had implemented significant changes, including mandatory diversity training, stricter enforcement of anti-discrimination policies, and the creation of an anonymous reporting system for employees to flag misconduct. These measures weren't perfect, but they represented progress, a step toward dismantling the systemic biases that had long plagued the industry. Outside the aviation world, Maya's story inspired similar reforms in other sectors. Schools introduced programs to teach students about privilege and prejudice. Corporations reevaluated their hiring practices to ensure equal opportunities for underrepresented groups. Even small businesses adopted inclusive policies, recognizing that fostering diversity wasn't just morally right, it was good for business too. But change didn't come without resistance. Some critics argued that these initiatives amounted to reverse discrimination or accused companies of pandering to political correctness. Others claimed the focus on accountability stifled free speech, pointing to Hayes' firing as evidence of a culture gone too far. Yet Maya remained undeterred, addressing such arguments head-on during public appearances. "If holding someone accountable for discriminatory behavior is considered controversial, then we need to rethink our priorities," she said during a panel discussion. "Freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequences. What happened to me wasn't about silencing anyone. It was about standing up against harmful behavior and demanding better." Her words resonated deeply with audiences, earning her widespread admiration. People admired not only her courage, but also her ability to rise above hostility with grace and wisdom. In time, Maya became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that strength lies not in reacting with anger but in responding with dignity. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes struggled to rebuild his life. Teaching at the regional flight school proved humbling, forcing him to confront his flaws daily. At first, he resisted feedback from both supervisors and students, clinging stubbornly to his old ways. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to change. Conversations with younger pilots eager to learn challenged his assumptions, while candid critiques from colleagues pushed him to examine his biases. One day, a student named Marcus approached him after class, visibly nervous. "Sir, can I ask you something?" he said hesitantly. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." Marcus took a deep breath. "I heard about what happened with the airline. Did it make you think differently about how you treat people?" The question caught Hayes off guard. For a moment he considered brushing it off or deflecting with sarcasm, the default response he'd relied on for years, but instead he found himself pausing, genuinely considering the implications of the young man's words. "Yeah," Hayes admitted finally, his tone softer than usual. "It did, and I'm still figuring things out." Marcus nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer. As he walked away, Hayes felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: accountability. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Over time, he came to understand that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and striving to do better moving forward. Despite his efforts, Hayes never fully regained the trust or respect he once commanded. His name remained tarnished, a cautionary tale whispered among industry insiders. Yet, even in his diminished state, he served an unintended purpose, reminding others of the importance of humility and empathy in leadership. As for Alex, covering the story transformed his career. The viral video catapulted him into the spotlight, earning him recognition as a journalist committed to uncovering truths that sparked positive change. He continued to report on issues of social justice, using his platform to amplify marginalized voices. Though proud of his accomplishments, he never forgot the woman who had inspired it all. "I owe a lot to Maya," Alex said during a podcast interview. "She showed me the power of storytelling, not just to inform but to inspire action. Without her courage, none of this would have been possible." In the end, the story of the arrogant pilot and the resilient neurosurgeon transcended its origins, becoming a testament to the enduring human spirit. It demonstrated that even in moments of injustice, grace and integrity could prevail. It reminded us that accountability isn't punishment, it's growth. And most importantly, it proved that one person's courage could ignite a movement capable of transforming countless lives. Years later, Maya reflected on the journey during a keynote speech at an international conference. Standing before a packed auditorium, she concluded with a message that encapsulated everything she had learned. Change begins when we refuse to accept the status quo. It starts with standing up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. My story is proof that even in the face of adversity, we have the power to create a better future for ourselves, for others, and for generations to come. As applause erupted around her, Maya stood tall, her presence a beacon of hope and determination. The road ahead was long, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Together, they would keep pushing forward, one step at a time.